For centuries, Carthage was the dominant power in the western Mediterranean. They rivaled the Roman Republic during its rise to empire, and nearly destroyed it. Savvy Carthaginian merchants bartered, bought, traded, and sold a vast variety of goods throughout the Mediterranean world, to a far afield as the west coast of Africa, and the island of Britain in the west. Carthage became a fabulously wealthy metropolis of over 500,000 people, and the envy of her Mediterranean neighbors. To the Greeks they were known as the Phoenicians, a name derived from the reddish-purple dye the Carthaginians and their ancestors from modern-day Lebanon became famous for producing and selling. The Romans transliterated the Greek name Phoenician into Punicus, for which the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage were later named. The people of Carthagast, or Carthage, meaning new city, considered themselves to be one people with that of their home city of Tyre. The Tyrians, and the other coastal cities of the Levant that the Greeks called Phoenician, considered themselves Canaans, which are the same people as the Canaanites mentioned in the Old Testament of the Bible. The Canaanites were the ancient indigenous people of the Levant. During the Late Bronze Age, those living on the coast of what is now Lebanon became masters in the construction of ships, seafaring, and commercial trading. After a long period of Egyptian domination, for 3 centuries, roughly between 1100 and 800 BC, these Canaanite cities thrived due to their expertise and lack of any major foreign imperial interference with their internal affairs. These seafaring Canaanites, aka Phoenicians, founded over 300 colonies throughout the Mediterranean. Originally, these were small towns of a few hundred people, comprising a fortified port, workshops, warehouses, all to aid commercial activities. Over the centuries, several of these grew into some of the largest and most prosperous cities in the Mediterranean. Carthage, meaning new city, as the name implies, was one of the later Phoenician colonies to be founded. According to legend, Carthage was founded in 814 BC by the Queen Dido, who fled Tyre after her husband was murdered by her greedy brother Pygmalion. Migration to Carthage and other Phoenician colonies drastically increased when the Assyrian Empire began to exert control over the Levant. During the first century of Carthage's establishment and growth, it was aided by the larger older Phoenician colony of Utica to its northwest. Early Carthage paid annual tribute to its mother city of Tyre, as well as yearly rent paid to the Libyan tribes to their south in return for occupying the city's land and surrounding agricultural area. Around the year 650 BC, Carthage had grown to the level where it founded the first of its very own colonies, directly ruled by an appointed magistrate. Over the next century, the Carthaginian sphere of influence increased in the western Mediterranean, as the fortunes of the Phoenicians in the east steadily declined. Assyria was overthrown by the Babylonians, who besieged Carthage's home city of Tyre for 13 years, eventually forcing it to pay a heavy annual tribute. Carthage then assumed the role as protector of all Phoenician colonies, whether they liked it or not, from pirates, inland natives, and especially the Greeks, who had also been aggressively colonizing the western Mediterranean. Relations between the two people were tense, often hostile, but yet very close. The Carthaginian king Mago I, who founded Carthage's most illustrious royal dynasty, married a Greek woman from the rival city-state of Syracuse. Mago secured an alliance with the Etruscan League of City-States, which also had largely hostile relations with the Greeks in the region. In a major victory, together they strategically defeated Greek colonial forces which had settled in Corsica. Carthage solidified control over Sardinia, while Corsica became subject to the Etruscans. During Mago's reign, Carthage stopped paying rent to the Libyans for use of their land. Tyre ceased to have any significant political influence over Carthage, as it was incorporated into the Persian Empire, and Carthage clearly established itself as the leading power in the region. Although most Phoenician cities accepted Carthage's protection willingly, some had to be coerced, such as the venerable city of Gades, which was besieged and taken by force. Mago's reign is commonly considered to be the beginning of the Carthaginian Empire. In the east, the Persian Achaemenid Empire conquered the Phoenician city-states and proceeded to incorporate them into their empire to a far greater extent than the Assyrians and Babylonians had done before. A Persian plan to expand westwards by conquering Carthage was thwarted when the Phoenician sailors who made up the vast majority of the Persian navy refused to set sail against their fellow countrymen. Instead, Persian plans for westward expansion narrowed to focus on the constantly quarreling Greek city-states, which didn't turn out so well. 38 years before the Battle of Thermopylae, Dorius, the brother of King Leonidas, who led 300 Spartans in their famous last stand against the Persians, set out to found a colony in North Africa. 3 years after its establishment, the Carthaginians rallied the Libyan tribes of the region to expel the Spartan invaders. This greatly increased tensions between Carthage and the Dorian Greeks in southern Sicily, who were related to the Spartans. The following year, in 509 BC, the city-state of Rome liberated itself from Etruscan domination and established the world's first republic. That same year, the Carthaginians dispatched an embassy to Rome to establish friendly trade relations and sign a treaty delineating Carthage's zone of control and the maritime rules Rome had to follow. The speed at which Carthage negotiated and implemented the lopsided treaty is testament to Carthaginian influence in the region and their adept awareness of foreign political matters. It is reasonable to assume that it was standard procedure for Carthage to sign similar treaties with other minor powers throughout the western Mediterranean to protect its dominant position in commerce. Although the Phoenicians on occasion were prone to infighting, their internal strife paled in comparison to the intense and bitter rivalries found among the Greek city-states of Magna Graecia. When the Greek tyrant of Syracuse began to consolidate power over the whole island of Sicily, his rivals petitioned Carthage to intervene and prevent this. The Carthaginian king Hamilcar spent 3 years gathering a massive army, supplies, and thousands of ships for the invasion of Sicily, which ended in disaster. At the Battle of Himera, the majority of the Carthaginian army and the king were slain. Approximately 150,000 pounds of silver were paid to the Syracusans in return for ending the war and keeping the borders as they had been before. This disaster led to a complete overhaul of the Carthaginian political system. The king had wielded near absolute power. However, this was checked by the fact that the nobility could vote him in and out of office, and the position was not hereditary. Afterwards, the king was relegated to a ceremonial position, and eventually phased out completely. His authority was replaced by 2 judges, called suffets, who both served single terms of office. The judges were elected by the Senate, which was several hundred members strong. The judges proposed subjects for the Senate to deliberate on. If a unanimous decision was reached, their word was final. If there was disagreement among the Senate, or a suffet objected, then a vote was taken by the popular assembly of citizens to decide a matter. Aristotle praised the Carthaginian system, as they did not suffer the yoke of a tyrant, nor the sedition common in Greek democracies. For 70 years, Carthage maintained peace with other Mediterranean powers, despite being repeatedly invited to join the Greeks' constant squabbling with one another. Carthage instead focused its energy on exploring, establishing new trade routes, and expanding its influence over the native Libyans and Numidians of North Africa. Internal control was also solidified in the empire through colonization. New colonies were founded and old ones reinforced with citizens from Carthage, many of whom were the poor and down and out who were compelled to go seek opportunity elsewhere. After 70 years of peace with the Greek city-states of Sicily, Carthage answered a Greek city's request for aid against the attacks of its neighbor. Taking advantage of this, Carthage sent a large invasion force to the island that won an impressive streak of battlefield victories and sieges. 4 of Sicily's wealthiest and most powerful cities were utterly destroyed. Much of their population was enslaved or massacred, in an act of retribution for the part they played in Carthage's humiliating defeat 70 years prior. The Second Sicilian War came to an end when a severe plague swept through the island, vanquishing a greater number than the war itself had. But a plague can only do so much. Carthage and Syracuse were at war with each other only 6 years later. Throughout the 4th century BC, 5 more wars were fought against Syracuse for the control of Sicily, most ending with one side receiving minor gains. The 7th of these Sicilian wars, Carthage conquered the entire island except Syracuse, which they besieged. The tyrant Agathocles of Syracuse managed to secretly lead a counterattack force of 14,000 men against Carthage itself. The Carthaginian army hastily abandoned their siege and returned home where they were defeated. Agathocles besieged Carthage for 2 years, but its defenses were too strong. The Carthaginians raised a new army, defeated the Sicilians, and made peace on favorable terms. The Carthaginians were then in effective control of all of Sicily, a goal they had diligently worked centuries to achieve, and they got to enjoy it for 28 years. In 280 BC, Pyrrhus, the king of Epirus, invaded southern Italy to defend the Greeks of Magna Graecia from Roman expansion. During his campaign there, he was victorious in a pair of costly battles, from which the term Pyrrhic victory is derived. He was then invited by the Greeks of Sicily to free them from Carthaginian rule and rid them of a piratical band of rogue mercenaries called the Mamertines, which he did. Unfortunately for the Sicilians, Pyrrhus established himself as a corrupt and oppressive leader. He began the construction of a fleet initially intended for the invasion of Carthage, but instead the fleet was used to evacuate his army from Sicily. The Carthaginians intercepted the fleet, and sank or disabled most of its warships. Carthage was then able to easily retake most of Sicily. Pyrrhus was defeated by the Romans, who subsequently completed the conquest of the Italian peninsula by 264 BC. During the Pyrrhic War, the Roman and Carthaginian republics had been allied together against Epirus, and had enjoyed friendly relations for 2.5 centuries. This came to an end when the Mamertines requested help from both Carthage and Rome against Syracuse. Rome and Carthage both showed up to help out, and quickly came into conflict with each other. The war lasted 23 years. The centrally located island of Sicily again became the stage for conflict. Syracuse took its old enemy Carthage's side in the war, until they switched sides after Rome besieged them. Both Rome and Carthage had dissimilar advantages. Carthage had the largest and best quality navy in the Mediterranean, and perhaps the world at the time, while Rome had far greater native manpower, which compelled Carthage to rely on large numbers of mercenaries. Throughout the war, both sides adapted to each other, and won resounding victories on land and sea. Rome suffered a major setback when it invaded North Africa in a failed attempt to take Carthage. However, by the end of the war, Rome had mastered naval combat after a great deal of trial and error. They decisively defeated Carthage at sea in one of the largest naval battles in human history. This loss compelled Carthage to sue for peace. The treaty stipulated that they abandon Sicily, as well as pay a large war indemnity to Rome. Shortly after, most of Carthage's mercenaries and allied vassals revolted, as Carthage could only afford to pay them a fraction of their promised wages. During this particularly brutal war, both Carthage and Utica were besieged, which allowed a revolting Corsica and Sardinia to be annexed by Rome. Ultimately, this war was brought to an end by the brilliant generalship of Hamilcar Barca. After its conclusion, Hamilcar embarked on the conquest of much of the Iberian Peninsula. He secured prolific silver mines, which allowed Carthage to make its war indemnity payments to Rome, and pay its own soldiers. In 236, Carthage's Numidian vassals rebelled, which was efficiently crushed. Hamilcar's son Hannibal, who accompanied him to Hispania, swore an oath as a child to be an enemy of Rome. He continued his father's expansion of the empire in the Iberian Peninsula, and then ignited the Second Punic War with Rome by conquering the Roman-allied city of Saguntum. Hannibal, some elephants, and an army of mercenaries then embarked on a daring campaign, crossing the formidable Alps mountain range. The Romans were completely caught off guard. In Italy, Hannibal won a string of brilliant victories against the numerically superior Romans. Despite successfully campaigning in the Italian peninsula for 15 years, the tenacious Romans refused to capitulate. The Roman general Scipio counterattacked Carthage on its own soil, which forced Hannibal to return to North Africa. The disgruntled Numidians, seeking independence, switched sides and joined the Roman cause. At the Battle of Zama, Hannibal was finally decisively defeated. During the Long War, Rome had lost a staggering 500,000 men, the majority of whom died in battle. In retaliation, Carthage was dealt harsh terms of surrender. Its empire was dismantled, and it was allowed to only keep 10 ships to defend itself. They were also forced to pay Rome a massive indemnity of 300 tons of silver. Even with this, there was many in Rome that feared a resurgent Carthage, and continually lobbied for the utter destruction of the city. In the half-century after the Second Punic War, the Numidians repeatedly raided Carthage's little remaining territory. In 151 BC, after Carthage paid back all of its debt to Rome, it raised an army to defend itself. Rome believed this violated the treaty that the Carthaginians believed was expired. As punishment, the Romans demanded that the Carthaginians disarm and abandon their city. When they refused, the Romans invaded and laid siege to Carthage. The majority of the city's population was massacred, and the rest sold into slavery. Carthage's palaces, temples, and great libraries were burnt to the ground, destroying history from Carthage's perspective. One of the major causes of the final Punic War may have been to seize Carthage's farmland. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, Rome's population had skyrocketed to nearly 500,000 people. whom they were already having difficulty feeding. Till the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, the farmland around Carthage provided the majority of the food for the city of Rome, and a rebuilt Roman city of Carthage was the major exporting hub of this grain. This has been Epimetheus, and I think if you enjoyed this video, you'll also enjoy my other videos I've made on ancient and classical history. And I would like to sincerely thank my patrons for supporting the drawing, research, and work I do on this channel. And all of you who are awesome enough to watch to the end of the video, leave a like, comment, and all that other great stuff.